The sun had barely peeked over the horizon when a sleek private jet touched down at Henderson Executive Airport. At the controls sat a man who had defied all odds to become one of the most successful figures in private aviation. As CEO of Sky Elite Aviation Solutions, he had transformed his childhood dream of flying into a thriving empire worth millions. Growing up in a modest neighborhood in Chicago, his fascination with flight began when his grandfather would take him to watch planes take off at O'Hare International. They'd sit for hours on a small hill near the airport, sharing sandwiches while the young boy pointed at each aircraft, rattling off make and model numbers he memorized from aviation magazines. "One day, I'll fly one of those," he'd tell his grandfather, who never once doubted him. Despite facing countless obstacles and hearing no more times than he could count, that determined young boy grew into an even more determined man. He worked multiple jobs through high school and college, saving every penny for flight lessons. While his friends spent weekends at parties, he spent his studying aviation manuals and logging flight hours. Starting as a commercial pilot for regional airlines, he quickly noticed a gap in the private aviation market. With a small business loan and every cent of his savings, he purchased his first aircraft, a modest but reliable Citation jet that had seen better days. He personally flew clients, cleaned the plane, and handled bookings, often working 20-hour days to make ends meet. 15 years later, Sky Elite Aviation Solutions operated a fleet of 35 private jets, serving clients across 4 continents. The company prided itself on excellence, reliability, and personalized service. Despite his success, the CEO never lost touch with his roots or his love of flying. He still occasionally piloted flights himself, believing that staying connected to the day-to-day operations kept him grounded and in tune with both his staff and clients. His office walls told the story of his journey, from his first pilot's license to numerous aviation safety awards. But his most prized possession was a worn photograph of him and his grandfather by that hill near O'Hare, their faces lit up with matching grins as a plane soared overhead. The photograph served as a daily reminder of where he came from and the power of unwavering belief in one's dreams. That morning, as he prepared for what should have been a routine charter flight, he had no idea that his success, his credentials, and even his basic right to be near his own aircraft would be questioned in a way that would spark a national conversation about prejudice and profiling in aviation. As he walked across the tarmac, his mind was focused on the pre-flight checklist and the weather conditions for his route to New York. The early morning light cast long shadows across the ground, and the air had that crisp quality unique to desert mornings. He took pride in maintaining his hands-on approach to the business, especially for high-priority flights like today's. He had built his reputation on attention to detail and excellence in service. From personally training his pilots to ensuring each aircraft in his fleet exceeded safety standards, he believed in leading by example. His employees often joked that he could spot a scratch on a plane's exterior from 100 yards away, a reputation he didn't mind having. Little did he know that this ordinary morning would become anything but routine, and his position as a respected aviation CEO would be challenged by someone who couldn't see past their own prejudices. The events that were about to unfold would not only test his patience and dignity, but would ultimately lead to a movement for change in the aviation industry. The morning at Henderson Executive Airport started like any other, with the gentle hum of distant engines and the sweet scent of jet fuel in the crisp desert air. The CEO of Sky Elite Aviation had arrived earlier than usual, dressed in his favorite navy blue sweater and khaki pants. He planned to change into his pilot's uniform after completing the pre-flight inspection, a ritual he never rushed, no matter how tight the schedule. Today's flight was particularly important. He would be flying a group of international investors to New York for a major business conference. As he walked across the tarmac towards his company's flagship Gulfstream G650, his mind ran through the day's logistics. The weather report showed clear skies all the way to the East Coast, and his ground crew had already begun preparing the aircraft for departure. He pulled out his tablet, checking the maintenance logs one last time. Even after thousands of flights, he still treated each pre-flight inspection with the same attention to detail as his very first solo flight. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. "Excellence isn't an act, it's a habit." Those words had guided him through every step of building his aviation empire. The morning sun gleamed off the polished exterior of the aircraft as he began his walk-around inspection. His trained eyes scanned every inch of the fuselage, checking control surfaces, examining the landing gear, and inspecting the engines. He'd learned long ago that no detail was too small when it came to aviation safety. Inside the cockpit, he settled into the familiar leather seat, his hands automatically reaching for switches and controls he knew by heart. The advanced glass cockpit displayed came to life with a soft glow as he began the preliminary system checks. He could have delegated this flight to any of his highly qualified pilots, but he enjoyed these occasional opportunities to stay connected with his first love, flying. The cabin crew arrived, greeting him with warm smiles as they began preparing the interior for the arriving passengers. They had worked together for years, and their efficiency showed in their seamless coordination. The lead flight attendant was already arranging the custom breakfast service that their high-profile clients had requested. As he continued through his checklist, he thought about how far he'd come from those early days of watching planes at O'Hare. Now he owned not just one aircraft, but an entire fleet of them. Yet success hadn't changed his fundamental approach to aviation, safety first always, with no exceptions and no shortcuts. He stepped out of the cockpit to do one final exterior check, his shoes clicking against the metal steps as he descended. The morning was warming up, and other aircraft were beginning to move around the airport as the day's operations picked up pace. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The aircraft was in perfect condition, the weather was ideal, and they were right on schedule. Standing beneath the wing, he made notes on his tablet about a small paint touch-up needed near one of the fuel caps. Nothing urgent, but his attention to detail demanded that even minor imperfections be documented and addressed. The rising sun cast his shadow long across the tarmac as he moved methodically around the aircraft. He was just completing his inspection of the tail section when he heard footsteps approaching rapidly from behind. In all his years of aviation, he'd learned to read the rhythm of an airport, and something about these footsteps seemed out of place. They carried an urgency that didn't fit the calm routine of a normal pre-flight preparation. Little did he know that these approaching footsteps would mark the beginning of an incident that would not only challenge everything he had built, but would also spark a national conversation about prejudice in the aviation industry. As he turned to face the source of those footsteps, he had no way of knowing that his routine morning was about to become anything but routine. The footsteps grew louder, and as the CEO turned around, he found himself face to face with a security officer whose badge identified him as newly transferred to the airport's security division. The officer's hand was already resting on his weapon, his stance aggressive and confrontational. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the suspicion in his eyes. "Step away from the aircraft immediately," the officer barked, his voice carrying across the quiet tarmac. The CEO maintained his professional composure, decades of experience in handling difficult situations evident in his calm response. "Good morning, officer. I'm just completing my pre-flight inspection. I'm the pilot for this morning's charter and also the owner of this aircraft." The officer's expression hardened. "Sure you are," he replied, sarcasm dripping from his words. "And I'm the President of the United States. Let's see some ID." The CEO slowly reached for his credentials, his movements deliberate and careful. "Of course. I have my pilot's license, aircraft registration, and company ID right here in May." "Don't move," the officer snapped, his hand tightening on his weapon. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The CEO froze, his heart racing, but his exterior remaining calm. Around them, ground crew members had stopped their work, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. "Officer, if you'll allow me to show you my credentials," he began again, his voice steady despite the tension. The officer cut him off. "You expect me to believe someone like you owns a private jet? This is a restricted area. How did you get past security?" The CEO took a deep breath, drawing on all his years of dealing with challenging situations. "I have full clearance and authorization. My company, Sky Elite Aviation Solutions, operates several aircraft from this airport. If you check with airport management." "Enough with the stories," the officer interrupted. "I've heard every excuse in the book. You're trespassing on private property and attempting to access a restricted aircraft. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." The morning that had started so routinely was rapidly spiraling into a nightmare. The CEO could see his crew watching helplessly from the cabin door, their faces a mixture of shock and concern. He thought about his grandfather's words about maintaining dignity in the face of adversity. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but there's been a serious misunderstanding." He tried one more time, his voice firm but respectful. "I've operated from this airport for over a decade. If you'll just contact the airport manager or check my credentials." The officer moved closer, his face twisted with unwarranted suspicion. "The only place we're contacting is Central Booking. You picked the wrong airport and the wrong day to try whatever you're trying." As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the CEO remained silent, his mind already racing ahead to how this situation could be resolved. He noticed several airport employees on their phones, likely contacting management. He knew it would only be a matter of time before this misunderstanding was cleared up, but the implications of what was happening hit him hard. The same tarmac he had walked across countless times as a respected business owner and pilot now felt different under his feet. The morning sun that had seemed so promising earlier now felt harsh and exposing. His aircraft, his pride and joy, stood silently behind him as he was led away from it like a common criminal. Throughout the humiliating ordeal, he maintained his composure, knowing that his response to this situation would be just as important as the incident itself. Years of facing challenges had taught him that sometimes the most powerful statement one could make was to remain dignified in the face of injustice. As word of the confrontation began spreading through the airport community, nobody realized that this incident would soon become a catalyst for change in the aviation industry. The CEO's only thought was of his grandfather's words about facing adversity with grace, never knowing that his composed response to this injustice would soon inspire others across the nation. The situation at Henderson Executive Airport continued to escalate as the officer radioed for backup, his voice filled with unwarranted urgency. "I've got a suspect in custody, attempting to access a private aircraft, requesting additional units and aircraft security protocol." The CEO stood quietly, his wrists now bound behind his back, watching as his entire morning unraveled before his eyes. 2 more patrol cars pulled up to the tarmac, their lights flashing silently in the morning sun. The original officer seemed to grow more confident with the arrival of his colleagues, puffing up with misplaced authority. "We'll need to impound this aircraft pending investigation," he announced, pulling out his phone to take pictures of the jet's registration numbers. The CEO's flight crew watched in disbelief from a distance, held back by another officer. His lead flight attendant was frantically trying to explain the situation, but her words fell on deaf ears. "He's our CEO. This is his company's aircraft. Please just check his credentials." The morning's charter clients had begun arriving at the terminal, only to be told their flight was delayed due to a security situation. Through the terminal windows, they could see their pilot, the owner of the company they trusted with their travel, being treated like a criminal. "Officer," the CEO spoke calmly, "despite the growing crowd of onlookers, in my right pocket you'll find my pilot's license and company ID. In my briefcase, which is in the cockpit, there's a folder with all aircraft documentation. One phone call to airport management will confirm everything I've told you." The officer scoffed, making no move to check the credentials. "Save it for the station. Right now, you're under arrest for trespassing, attempted theft of aircraft, and resisting an officer's commands." Each false charge felt like a physical blow, but the CEO maintained his composure, knowing that losing his cool would only make the situation worse. Inside the terminal, word was spreading quickly. Ground crew members who had worked with the CEO for years were making urgent calls to airport management. The cleaning staff, who knew him from his early morning flights, shook their heads in disbelief. Even competing charter companies' pilots, who recognized him as a respected figure in the industry, were pulling out their phones to record the incident. The officer began reading him his rights, speaking loudly as if performing for his growing audience. The CEO closed his eyes briefly, thinking of all the mornings he'd spent on this very tarmac, building his dream into reality. The same space that had once represented freedom and opportunity now felt suffocating. His thoughts drifted to his grandfather's photo in his office, wondering what the old man would say about this moment. Somehow, he knew his grandfather would tell him to hold his head high and let the truth speak for itself. So he stood straight, dignified despite the handcuffs, as the officer continued his misguided process. The backup officers began searching his flight bag, pulling out logbooks and maintenance records as if they were evidence of wrongdoing. One of them held up his pilot's uniform, still in its dry-cleaning bag, with suspicious eyes. "Found this in the cockpit," he announced, as if discovering contraband instead of standard pilot equipment. The CEO's company ID badge had fallen from his pocket during the search, landing face up on the tarmac. An observant ground crew member noticed it, trying to get the officer's attention. "Look, right there, that's his ID." But the officers were too caught up in their presumed big arrest to pay attention to evidence that would end their moment of authority. Just as they began to lead him toward a patrol car, a commotion arose from the direction of the terminal. Several figures were hurrying across the tarmac, their faces set with purpose. The CEO recognized the airport's chief of security leading the group, followed by his company's operations director and the airport manager. The morning sun had fully risen now, illuminating the scene in harsh clarity. The CEO knew that within moments, this entire situation would be resolved, but the impact of what had just happened, what was still happening at airports across the country to others like him, wouldn't fade with the morning shadows. Little did the arresting officer know that his actions were about to backfire spectacularly, turning what he thought was a routine arrest into a moment that would spark a national conversation about prejudice and profiling in aviation. The truth was about to come to light, but its revelation would be just the beginning of a much larger story. The airport's chief of security moved across the tarmac with purposeful strides, his face a mix of concern and disbelief. Behind him, a group of airport officials and Sky Elite Aviation's senior staff hurried to keep pace. The morning sun cast their long shadows ahead of them as they approached the scene of the confrontation. "Release him immediately," the chief commanded, his authoritative voice cutting through the tension. The arresting officer's smugness faltered for the first time as he sensed the shift in atmosphere. "Sir, this suspect was attempting to." "That suspect owns this entire aircraft fleet," the chief interrupted, his voice sharp with disapproval. "He's the CEO of Sky Elite Aviation and one of our airport's most respected operators. Release him, now." The color drained from the officer's face as the reality of his mistake began to sink in. His hands trembled slightly as he fumbled with the handcuff keys. Around them, phones continued recording, capturing the moment when prejudice met truth in the clear morning light. The CEO rubbed his wrists as the handcuffs came off, maintaining his dignified composure even in vindication. His operations director rushed forward with his suit jacket, which had been discarded during the search. "Sir, are you all right? We came as soon as we heard." The airport manager stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment. "This is completely unacceptable. I want you to know that this officer's actions do not reflect our airport's values or policies. He's new to our facility, but that's no excuse for this level of unprofessionalism." The arresting officer stood frozen, his earlier confidence evaporating as he realized the magnitude of his error. The same aircraft he had accused the CEO of attempting to steal now stood as a gleaming testament of the success of the man he had wrongfully arrested. Other pilots and airport staff had gathered at a respectful distance, their faces showing a mix of anger and support. The CEO's flight crew had moved closer, their relief evident as they retrieved his scattered belongings from where the officers had strewn them during their overzealous search. "Your company operates 35 aircraft from this facility," the chief of security continued, addressing the officer while gesturing to the row of hangars bearing the Sky Elite Aviation logo. "That's nearly 20% of our private aviation traffic. Did you even bother to check his ID before making assumptions?" The officer's face reddened as he struggled to find words. I was just following protocol for unauthorized access." His voice trailed off as he realized how hollow his excuses sounded in the face of facts. The CEO straightened his jacket and turned to address his waiting passengers who had witnessed everything from the terminal. "Please accept my sincere apologies for the delay. We'll be ready for departure in 30 minutes. His professional demeanor, maintained even after such treatment, stood in stark contrast to the officer's crumbling authority. The airport's head of operations approached with the CEO's pilot's license and company ID, which had been ignored during the confrontation. "Sir, your credentials." Again, we are deeply sorry for this incident. We'll be launching a full investigation immediately. As the morning chaos began to settle, the CEO looked around at the scene, his aircraft, his crew, his business that he'd built from nothing. The same determination that had driven him to succeed against all odds now filled him with a new purpose. This incident, though painful, could be transformed into an opportunity for change. Phones continued recording as he walked back to his aircraft, head held high. Social media was already buzzing with videos of the incident. What started as one officer's biased assumption was about to become a national conversation about prejudice in aviation, but first, there was a flight to New York to complete. The officer watched, still stunned, as the CEO he had just handcuffed began his pre-flight checks again, resuming his duties as if the interruption had been nothing more than a passing cloud. Little did anyone know that this moment would become a turning point, not just for one airport's security policies, but for the entire aviation industry's approach to diversity and profiling. The first phone call came early that morning. A local news reporter, her voice a mix of excitement and professional curiosity, wanted to know everything. How could a respected business owner be treated this way? What really happened during that traffic stop? Word spread faster than wildfire these days. Social media became a megaphone for truth, with people sharing screenshots, videos, and personal stories of similar encounters. What started as one incident was quickly becoming a conversation about something much larger. In the small news station's conference room, producers huddled around computer screens. Raw footage, police reports, interview clips. They knew they had more than just a story. They had a spotlight that could shine on systemic issues many had chosen to ignore for too long. The business owner sat in his living room, surrounded by legal documents and support from his team. He wasn't looking for revenge. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about making sure something like this could never happen again to anyone else. Local community leaders started making calls. Civil rights organizations mobilized. What seemed like a single incident was revealing deeper, more painful truths about how some people in positions of power treated others. During a press conference, the words came carefully but firmly. No anger, no bitterness. Just a clear, powerful statement about dignity, respect, and the right to be treated fairly. Cameras clicked. Reporters leaned forward. The room felt electric with possibility. The police department was caught off guard. Internal investigations began. Body camera footage was reviewed. Conversations happened behind closed doors that had never happened before. Leadership realized this wasn't just about one officer, it was about a culture that needed serious change. Social media became a battleground of support and understanding. People shared personal stories that had been hidden for years. Professionals from all walks of life spoke up, lawyers, doctors, teachers, all sharing moments when they'd been treated differently because of how they looked. One video went viral. The business owner speaking directly to the camera, his voice calm but powerful. No accusations, no anger. Just a simple request for understanding, for change, for a world where your dreams aren't limited by the color of your skin. Community meetings started happening, not just protests, but real conversations. People sitting together, listening to each other. Some were uncomfortable, some were defensive, but many were truly hearing these stories for the first time. The local city council got involved. Discussions about police training became serious. Review boards were established. It wasn't just about punishing one officer, it was about creating real, lasting change. Legal teams worked overtime. Every document was examined. Every statement carefully considered. This was about more than a lawsuit. It was about setting a precedent that would protect others in the future. Local businesses started showing support. Statements were released. Training programs were redesigned. The ripple effect of one incident was touching every corner of the community. During a community gathering, an elderly woman approached the business owner. Her eyes were filled with tears. "We've been waiting for someone to speak up," she said, holding his hand. "Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth." News networks picked up the story. What started as a local incident was now a national conversation. Experts were invited to discuss systemic racism, police accountability, and the importance of understanding each other. The business owner never sought to be a hero. He was just trying to do what was right, to create a path for others, to show that one person's voice could make a difference. As weeks passed, the initial shock began to settle, but something had changed. Conversations were happening. People were listening. Real change was starting to take root. The officer involved faced serious consequences, not just disciplinary action, but a complete reevaluation of his role in law enforcement. It wasn't about punishment, it was about understanding and education. Through it all, the business owner remained focused. This wasn't about him. This was about creating a better world for everyone. A world where your potential wasn't judged by your appearance, but by your character and your dreams. One conversation at a time. One moment of understanding at a time. That's how real change happens. The story was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, there was hope. Real, tangible hope that things could be different. The courtroom felt different that day. Gone was the tension of previous hearings, replaced by a quiet sense of hope that filled the room. Our protagonist, a successful business owner who had faced an unimaginable ordeal, stood tall, his presence speaking volumes more than any words could. The settlement wasn't just about money, it was about something bigger. Something that would change lives long after the court documents were filed away. As the judge read through the final terms, everyone could feel the weight of the moment, a small but significant victory against a system that had tried to break him. Back at the office, things were buzzing with energy. The team gathered around, not as employees, but as a family united by something profound. Coffee mugs steamed, phones buzzed with congratulatory messages, and there was a sense of pride that went beyond just winning a legal battle. "We're going to do something different," he told his team, his voice calm but determined. The foundation they were about to launch wasn't just another corporate social responsibility project. It was personal, born from pain, but driven by hope. Growing up, he'd seen firsthand how a single moment of prejudice could derail someone's entire future. How a wrong assumption could crush dreams before they even had a chance to take flight. Now he had a platform, and more importantly, a responsibility. The scholarship program took shape quickly. Not just any scholarship, but one that would provide more than just financial support. Mentorship, guidance. A network of support for young people who looked like him, who came from communities often overlooked and underestimated. Every Saturday, he'd spend hours talking with students, sharing stories, listening to their dreams. It wasn't about creating carbon copies of himself, but about showing them what was possible. That their background wasn't a limitation, it was a source of strength. The aviation training program became something special. Young people who never imagined they could pilot a plane were now learning the intricate details of flight. Kids from neighborhoods where most people rarely traveled beyond city limits were now dreaming of soaring above the clouds. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were tough conversations. Painful discussions about systemic barriers, about the realities of racism that couldn't be solved with a single lawsuit or scholarship. He didn't shy away from these talks. Instead, he leaned into them, creating spaces where honest dialogue could happen. His own company became a beacon of change. Hiring practices changed. Leadership positions opened up. The aviation industry, traditionally dominated by a narrow demographic, started to look different, more diverse, more representative of the world it served. The media attention eventually died down. The headlines faded, but the work continued, quietly, persistently. Each student who graduated, each young professional who found their path, they were living proof that change was possible. During one of the scholarship dinners, a young woman approached him. Her hands were slightly shaking, her eyes bright with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. "I never thought someone like me could be a pilot," she said. "Thank you for showing me I could." Those moments made everything worth it. The arrest, the legal battles, the stress. They were just chapters in a larger story of transformation. Years later, when people asked him about that day, the day everything changed, he'd simply smile. "It wasn't about me," he'd say. "It was about creating a path for others." The foundation grew. The scholarship program expanded. But more importantly, a conversation had started. A conversation about equality, about opportunity, about seeing people for who they truly are. As evening fell and he looked out over the city from his office, he knew the journey was far from over. But for the first time, he felt truly free. Not just from the legal battles or the painful memories, but free in a way that meant he could help others find their own freedom. One conversation, one opportunity, one dream at a time.